The final steps in the pre-award process is the application review. DOJ applicants can submit their applications online through either the Federal Grants Portal, grants.gov, the DOJ Grants Management System utilized by OJP and OVW, or the COPS Office Agency's portal. Each program solicitation will specify which system should be used for that program and will contain detailed technical instructions on how to register with that system and apply for funding. All applicants must obtain a Data Universal Numbering System, known as a DUNS number, and register with the System for Award Management, also known as SAMS. Also, during the application review process, the applicant's financial integrity will be assessed. This will consist of identifying what type of organization is applying for federal assistance, whether a state, local, or tribal government. There also may be a requirement to complete a financial questionnaire so the grant-making component can assess the applicant's accounting practices or determine if there are any outstanding federal debts owed. Further, the applicant's most recent audit report will help with this integrity review. The financial integrity review may lead to an applicant being placed on the DOJ high-risk list. Applicants can be placed on this list for reasons such as history of unsatisfactory performance, not meeting program goals and objectives, not being financially stable, having a financial management system that does not meet the standards set forth in 2 CFR Part 200.302, have not conformed to the terms and conditions of previous awards, have open single audit or open audit recommendations from the Office of Inspector General, or OIG, significant non-compliance issues, or otherwise not responsive. For example, not responding to inquiries for open site visits or requests for information from the DOJ program staff. Now let us take a look at the actual CTAS budget review process. The budget categories are personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, construction, subawards and procurement contracts, the other category, and indirect cost. The personnel category. This section should identify the position, for example, a grant coordinator, their title, whether director or sheriff, the percentage of time each individual will spend on the project, whether 50% or 100%, and the annual salary that will be paid to each person that will work on the grant. Also, don't forget to include cost of living allowance, known as COLA, if this is something your agency pays. Remember, all costs must be necessary, reasonable, allowable, and allocable. The next slide will show how to properly reflect personnel and their salaries in your organization. Applicants should always provide a brief narrative with each budget category to assist the financial analyst with determining whether costs are necessary, reasonable, and allowable. The fringe benefits category should detail all the benefits which will be paid with federal funds. For example, FICA, health, retirement, and workman's comp. There should be no unallowable fringe benefits included in this section. Again, the next slide reflects how to properly display fringe benefits in your application. I will now turn the program over to Bill.
Thank you, Michael. For the budget review section, I will be discussing specific requirements for the COPS Office review of Purpose Area 1 applications. I will follow Michael and Suhaila for each category. Personnel category. Award funds may be used only to pay entry-level salaries and fringe benefits for 36 months for full-time career law enforcement officers, including village public safety officers hired or rehired on or after the award start date, as well as salaries and fringe benefits for methamphetamine coordinator. You may use the award funds to hire or rehire experienced officers, but award funding must be limited to paying your agency's entry-level salary and fringe benefits. Any costs higher than the entry level must be paid by your agency with local funds. Provide the negotiated approved annual salary for an entry-level officer in year 1 with reasonably anticipated increases in year 2 and year 3. Salary and fringe benefit payments must be based on payroll records supported by time and attendance records or their equivalent. Award funds may also be used to pay the approved entry-level salaries and fringe benefits of newly hired officer recruits while they are in basic academy training prior to swearing them in, if it is in your agency's standard practices to pay recruits while in training. Positions may be requested specifically to address methamphetamine issues within the tribe in order to enhance the tribal law enforcement's capacity to prevent, solve, and control crime and engage in anti-methamphetamine activities. Sworn officer, village public safety officer, and civilian methamphetamine coordinator are the only positions available to request. The cost of overtime pay included in salary and wages is an unallowable cost and should not be requested on the application budget or entered as an expense for reimbursement on the quarterly federal financial report. Fringe benefits category. Provide the negotiated approved cost of the agency's portion of each fringe benefit on the appropriate line item and appropriate year. Your benefits package should reflect the same items and percentages that any other officer in your agency would receive in the absence of a COPS Office award. A fringe benefits package can be calculated based on a federally negotiated agreement. This agreement must be current at the time of application. If you have included an estimated increase in the annual salary for years 2 and 3, then your fringe benefits may be increased accordingly. Provide detailed explanations for the line items requested in this category. If you have items that were lumped together on the other cost line item, please list them separately in the narrative section. Review the allowable, unallowable cost list for items that do not have a dedicated line item. The cost of overtime pay related to fringe benefits are unallowable costs and should not be requested on the application budget or entered as an expense for reimbursement on the quarterly federal financial report.
In the travel category, the first thing the financial analyst will look for is whether the applicant has its own travel policy or whether they are following the federal travel guidelines. This section should include a brief reason for the travel. Also, there should be a complete computation for the number of travelers to include per diem and lodging. The mode of any transportation should be reflected. For example, air, taxi, shuttle, or POV. Sometimes applicants forget to include local travel expenses or other costs associated with their travel. For example, additional expenses may be incurred from home to the airport or train station, or any related parking or tolls fees. This slide shows a travel listed as TBD or to be determined. This may occur when the grant-making component is in the planning stage for an event that grant recipients will be required to attend and budget for. However, without knowing a specific destination, as a general practice, your agency should always estimate these costs to be outside of your agency's jurisdiction.
A few notes I would like to add for OVW recipients is that everyone should verify in the solicitation if there's a required amount for OVW-sponsored technical assistance and training travel costs. If the solicitation requires this, you must include it in the budget in this category. For example, there may be a travel requirement of $20,000 for OVW-sponsored TA and training. So you will break down this amount in the travel category and identify each line item for this purpose. It's important to also note that this category should be used solely for direct staff travel. Any costs for survivor or client assistance should be included in the other category. And last, the purchase or lease of any vehicle should not be included in this category. However, what can be included is any expenses for staff mileage related to program travel costs.
Again, make sure to include a brief narrative. For all OJP-funded contracts for events that include 30 or more participants, both federal and non-federal, lodging costs for any number of attendees requiring lodging, even if the number is 1, you must not exceed the federal per diem rate for lodging. However, this is not a requirement if the number of participants to attend a conference is less than 30 people. Information on lodging rates and per diem amounts can be found on the GSA website and in the DOJ Grants Financial Guide.
Travel category for Purpose Area 1. The COPS office agrees with the information that was just explained for this category. Additional points for Purpose Area 1 are as follows. For Purpose Area 1, the applicant should include the estimated cost for travel and accommodations for 2 staff to attend 1 3-day-long meeting in Washington, D.C. This is not mandatory, but may occur. Airfare, lodging, per diem, and mileage reimbursement for meeting or training costs related to purpose area activities, including costs associated with any DOJ-required training and anti-methamphetamine training. Travel must be more than 50 miles from program location. Law enforcement training, such as, but not limited to, basic and comprehensive or specialized police training at a state academy or the Indian Police Academy in Artesia, New Mexico, as well as community policing, computer and crime reporting, for example, uniform crime reports training and anti-methamphetamine training. Refer to the allowable costs list for guidance on what type of training can be requested. Travel expenses for consultants should be included in the consultant travel data fields under the subawards, subgrants, procurement contracts category. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet, and the budget narrative should provide greater details about the items that you have requested.
The financial analyst will look to see if the applicant is following their own capitalization policy for equipment. If no policy exists, the applicant must follow the federal policy. Generally, equipment should be listed separately or completely broken out. For example, a computer should be listed by each individual component. For example, the keyboard, screen, etc. Additionally, the purpose of any equipment should be listed and how it relates to the program. The federal definition for equipment is it must have a useful life of more than 1 year with a fair market value of $5,000 or more. Equipment should be used by the recipient for its stated purpose and for as long as the recipient has a need for this equipment. When equipment is no longer needed for criminal justice purposes and its fair market value is less than $5,000, the equipment can be retained with no further obligation to the awarding agency. See 2 CFR Part 200.313, Item 5E. However, if the fair market value is $5,000 or more, the equipment may be retained or sold. However, the proceeds or federal share must be returned to the awarding agency. For example, if you had a 25% matching requirement on your grant and you sold the equipment for $100, $75 of those proceeds must be returned to the grant-making component.
One note I would like to add for OVW recipients is to ensure that if you are including the cost of a vehicle, that only the purchase should be categorized in equipment. If you are leasing the vehicle, that should be included in the consultants and contracts category. Additionally, a lease versus purchase analysis should always be provided if a vehicle is included in the budget. The analysis should demonstrate that the most cost-effective measures were taken for the decision to either lease or purchase a vehicle and should be supported by various quotes for each. Your financial analysts can provide additional clarification for this requirement if you have any questions.
Again, this slide shows a breakout of equipment along with a short narrative. I will now turn it over to Bill.
Examples of law enforcement equipment include police vehicles, such as police cars, SUVs, ATVs, boats, etc., as needed for law enforcement and anti-methamphetamine activities. Technology such as computer hardware and software, mobile data terminals, narrowband radio upgrades, and dispatch and communication systems. Each recipient must use any equipment funded through a COPS Office award for approved award-related purposes and must retain the equipment for the life of the award. Refer to the allowable cost list for guidance on what can be requested. For more information on disposition or capitalization of equipment, please see 2 CFR 200 in the related sections.
In the supplies category, applicants should list these items by major types. Example, office, training, postage. Also with this category, applicants should detail how supplies will support their efforts. Again, this slide shows how supplies should be broken out along with a narrative. I will now turn it over to Suhaila.
Another note I would like to add for OVW recipients is to ensure that supplies are separated in this category by the type of supply that it is. So for example, general office supplies will have a different line item breakdown from specific program supplies. A noteworthy change with the new regulations is that computing devices can be considered a supply item rather than equipment if the acquisition cost is less than either the capitalization threshold or $5,000, whichever is less, and this is regardless of the length of its useful life.
Supplies category for Purpose Area 1. The COPS Office agrees with the information that was just explained for this category. Additional points for Purpose Area 1 are as follows. For more information on supplies that are allowable or unallowable, please refer to the allowable cost list for guidance on what can be requested. All requested items must be listed in the Budget Detail Worksheet and also described in greater detail in the Budget Narrative section at the end of each category.
Constructions. Construction costs are normally not allowable with DOJ funds. However, if a grant-making component should allow construction, the applicant must include all pertinent information in reference to construction. Please note that construction costs are only allowable under Purpose Areas 4 and 9. Again, this slide shows how construction should be broken out along with a brief narrative. Subawards or subcontracts and procurement contracts. This section has recently been revised to better distinguish subrecipients from a true procurement contract. If an applicant will be making subawards to other entities, the applicant may be required to report this subaward in the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act system, also known as FFATA, which will be discussed in detail later. On the other hand, a procurement contract may involve consulting with individuals or an agency. However, if the procurement contract will be awarded to an individual, DOJ currently has a maximum threshold that can be paid an individual without prior approval. That amount is $650 per day for an 8-hour day. Even though the current threshold is set at $650, an individual consultant should be paid what he or she is worth and not what the current threshold is set at. In reference to sole source contracting, Bill covered this requirement earlier in our program. This slide shows the breakout for this category. Again, please provide a narrative with this section.
Subawards or subgrants and procurement contracts category for Purpose Area 1. The COPS Office agrees with the information that was just explained for this category. Additional points for Purpose Area 1 are as follows. All requested items must be listed in the Budget Detail Worksheet and also described in greater detail in the Budget Narrative section at the end of each category.
The other category. Generally, if it did not fit within one of the previous categories just discussed, then it must belong in the other category. Now, the same requirements hold true for this budget category as well. Costs should be identified by their major types, and the basis for those costs should be included. Once again, this slide shows how the other categories should be broken out along with a narrative.
For OVW recipients, this is where you will add costs like survivor and client emergency assistance costs, healing group supply items, shelter supply costs, and others.
Include items not defined as equipment or supplies. The other cost category serves as a catch-all for any items that you have determined to be allowable but are unsure what category to put it in. You can contact the COPS office at 1-800-421-6770 for assistance, or you can list it here and see where it ends up after budget review. Yes, the COPS office does pay for background checks. Although they are not required, background checks are highly recommended. For more information, please see the Award Owner's Manual for the specific DOJ program that you have received funding for. Refer to the allowable cost list for guidance on what can be requested. All requested items must be listed in the Budget Detail Worksheet and also described in greater detail in the Budget Narrative section at the end of each category.
Indirect costs. Applicants that have a current negotiated indirect cost rate should include a copy of the agreement as an attachment with their application. However, as discussed earlier, the current regulations allow those non-federal entities that have never received a negotiated indirect cost rate the option to elect to charge a de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. This option should be outlined in the application. Again, this slide shows the details for this category along with a brief narrative.
Indirect cost category for Purpose Area 1. The COPS office agrees with the information that was just explained for this category. Additional points for Purpose Area 1 are as follows. All applicants who are requesting indirect costs will need to submit an approved current indirect cost rate agreement that was negotiated and signed by your cognizant federal agency. If you are currently in negotiations with your cognizant federal agency for a current indirect cost rate agreement, please provide an email confirmation from them. Base means the accumulated direct costs, normally either total direct salaries and wages or total direct costs exclusive of any extraordinary or distorting expenditures, used to distribute indirect costs to individual federal awards. The direct cost base selected should result in each federal award bearing a fair share of the indirect costs in reasonable relation to the benefits received from the costs. It is extremely helpful when the applicant provides a current indirect cost rate, understands the type of rate that has been approved, and identifies all of the direct costs that will be used to create the direct cost base for the award that is being reviewed. The line item for this category specifically asks for the approved indirect cost rate and the direct cost base that the approved rate will be applied against. All requested items must be listed in the Budget Detail Worksheet and also described in greater detail in the Budget Narrative section at the end of each category.
The following slide shows a budget summary of each purpose area under the CTAS program. In conclusion, here are the top 5 reasons budgets do not initially clear. 1. The required match has not been met or its source identified. 2. Unallowable costs are included within the detailed budget worksheet. 3, the budget narrative is incomplete. 4, a current federally approved indirect cost agreement has not been submitted. And 5, the narrative content is not consistent with the line items in the worksheet.
COPS Office tips for budgets in Purpose Area 1. Your agency may not use TRGP, which is the Tribal Resource Grant Program Hiring Awards or Equipment Training Awards, funds for any costs that are not identified as allowable in the Financial Clearance Memorandum. 2, you must read all documentation regarding solicitation and award management carefully. 3, start filling out the application early, ask questions, and submit before the deadline. 4, provide a current federally approved indirect cost rate agreement with your application if applicable. 5, be sure that the narrative content is consistent with the line item breakdown in the worksheet.